What you know, Alibis, welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here. It's Wednesday, April 30th. We are on day 7 of the retrial of Karen Reed. Let's jump back in. She is still on direct exam. Jen says when she was giving John directions to Fairview, she told him to go past Bella's Street and to follow on down to the end. They play the 911 call and they ask her why she said there is a man in the snow and not say his name. She said she wanted to get the details to them quickly. She saw bleeding from his face after Carrie was putting blankets under his head. Karen was worried he may choke on blood and wanted to move him, but Carrie said no. The witness called her sister, who didn't answer. Then she got on the ground to take over compressions and then got up to wave the first officer arriving on scene. She said Karen would run to the officer, run away, come back. She was doing this repetitive screaming and asking, could I have hit him? Did I hit him? She says she did know several people on scene, including Sergeant Lank. They wanted Karen to sit in the police cruiser because she was hysterical. Jen sat in the back with her, and Carrie was standing at the door. Jen said they prayed and held hands. Karen asked who's going to take care of his kids. When they saw John being taken to the ambulance, Karen and Jen got out of the car, and that's when she says Karen asked her to Google hypothermia and how long it takes to die in the cold. There were some misspellings on that search, and she explains her MS makes it hard in hot or cold temperatures because it makes her fingers numb, and that affects her motor skills. She said she had not searched for that phrase before that time, and she doesn't know what came up. She misspelled things and tried a second search, but she doesn't think she paid attention to the results because Karen was back to screaming and asking Carrie if John was dead. Karen was talking to a first responder, and Jen heard Karen say, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. That startled her, and she asked Karen what she was saying. She thought she was just talking crazy, and Jen said she was trying to look out for Karen. There's an objection that's sustained. Officer Lank asked her to go wake up her sister and her sister's husband. So she went into the front door, which was unlocked. She went and knocked and opened their bedroom door and woke them up. She said it took a minute or two to get them awake, but when they did, Brian was startled, asking what was going on, and they both were confused. So they got up and got dressed. She spoke to them and they all went downstairs. Officer Lank was inside the house and spoke with her sister and brother-in-law. The witness did not stick around for that. A little bit later, Jen's husband, Matt, arrived on scene, and Officer Lank wanted to talk to Matt outside. They play some dash cam of the officer arriving. She identifies where everybody is, what's happening at certain points, when she's doing the Google search at Karen's request, when she goes into her sister's house, and then you see a light come on outside the house. After she went inside the house and after the ambulance left with John, she talked to her husband and Carrie. Carrie was going to pick up John's parents. Officer Lank said somebody needed to stay at Fairview to talk to troopers who were on their way. Jen talked to her sister and brother-in-law. Julie Albert came by to drop something off, and then Brian invited her inside. She said they're all sitting at the kitchen table, and she was calling Carrie to try to get updates about John. She said at this point, deep down, she knew he was dead, but she was trying to hold out some hope. She did speak to Karen when Karen was in the back of the ambulance, and she texted her later in the day asking for Carrie's number, but there was no response. She said the two of them have never spoken since that moment. Other people who showed up to Fairview was Brian Higgins and Chris Albert. She said they all talked about what happened, and mainly people asking her questions about how the morning unfolded and everybody trying to figure out what happened. As she sat there, things started coming back to her, particularly when Karen said, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. Later that day, she called Officer Lank and asked him to come back to Fairview. And when he did, she was sitting with the group and told him what she remembered about Karen saying. She stayed at Fairview until about 11 or 11:30. Trooper Proctor from the state police called. She doesn't know how he got her number, but he wanted to come by and question her. He ended up going to her house with another officer. Her husband was there, and Brian Albert came over. She told Proctor what Karen said about hitting John and gave them a narrative of the morning's events. At that point, she didn't say anything about the broken tail light, but a few hours later, she had another conversation with them and told them about Karen's broken tail light. She learned John passed away while still at the Alberts' house. Friends were calling and texting as they were hearing the news, and she responded to some. The next day, she went over to John's house with Carrie and their daughters to offer support. She said there were a lot of people there, but she didn't see Karen. She talked to John's mother, and Jen left with Carrie. Jen's daughter stayed at John's house, and Carrie's daughter was good friends with Sergeant Lank's daughter, so they dropped her at his house. Mrs. Lank came out to offer support and condolences, and she got into the back seat. Jen thinks she went inside the Lanks' residence to use the restroom, and Carrie was explaining the morning events to Miss Lank. Mrs. O'Keefe asked them to get together a timeline, so they got together with Carrie. Jen's sister was there, and she was the one writing down what was being said. She had a lot of conversations and interviews with different officers. Later, they asked to take her phone and make a copy, and she was cooperative, and she said to help in any way she could. That was it for direct, and it's time for cross-exam. When did you last speak to Carrie before your testimony? Jen said that she called her last night. They did not discuss each other's testimony, and they didn't talk about Carrie's testimony from last week. She said they have never discussed their testimonies regarding either trials. They have discussed the case and what happened that morning. The defense asked, from last year's trial to this trial, you have discussed the case? And Jen says many times, but not testimony. They just talked about what happened. Defense, if you discussed Carrie's perceptions and yours as well, you've compared what you each remember. Jen said she wouldn't say that. She would say they've talked about what they've discussed in the moment as this was happening, but not a comparison. She discussed the phone call from Karen just before 5, even though Carrie wasn't present, as well as other details about the event. She said that they've discussed a lot of things and they've gotten to be very close. The defense wants to know how many times they've discussed this, and Jen said it's hard to say. They have bonded over this trauma. The defense says the glue in your relationship is the foundation of many conversations, and Jen said we also talk about other things like girlfriends do. Defense, is it hundreds of their individual perceptions they've talked about? Jen said they've talked about it time and time again. It's been a few years since this happened, and it traumatized their lives. They ask if she's met with anyone from the DA's office in anticipation of her appearance in this trial. She talked to Mr. Brennan. She names other people who were there during some of these meetings: McLaughlin, Mr. Lally, Trooper Tully. The witness advocate was there at some of these, and she said she's probably had 4 to 5 meetings in total. The most recent was last night in a Zoom call. She said the court asked, and then the judge jumped in and told her not to continue. The defense, not including last night, were you asked questions about your testimony in the first trial? She said they watched some of the direct and cross-exam, and Brennan shows her a dash cam and waterfall video. The defense, as far as your demeanor in the last trial, was that discussed? Objection sustained. Were you asked to change your demeanor from the last trial? Jen said no, I was told to slow down and answer to the best of her memory. Defense, were there discussions to talk about being a sports mom? No. You didn't practice testimony for this trial. There was no fake, direct, or cross-exam? No. The first meeting was very quick, according to Jen. The second meeting was longer. It was about a couple of hours. That's when they watched videos and looked at photos of John's house. She doesn't think the meetings were recorded, and she doesn't know in total how many hours they've met. They move on to talking about her family, and they're very close-knit. She's known Brian Albert since kindergarten. She's close to Chris Albert, who is Brian's brother, as well as Julie Albert. The defense points out that Chris Albert is a Canton Select board member and the Canton PD reports to that select board. The witness doesn't know. Defense. Brian was a Boston police officer before recently retiring, and he's a trained first responder. Brian and Chris have a brother named Kevin, who is a detective with Canton. You grew up in Canton and you have 3 sisters. He names these relations that the families have with Chris, Brian, Nicole, the witness, and Matt. She said they have gatherings, they go on vacations, they spend weekends together, sporting events. Moving back to January 28th, members of the Albert and McCabe family went to Waterfall together and then back to your sisters for the after party. Yes. He asked if there is a family connection to the police department. There's an objection that's sustained. The defense. Is there a connection with your family and the Massachusetts State Police? She said Julie and Chris are close with your family and the Massachusetts State Police. And you're aware Michael Proctor's sister Courtney is basically best friends with Julie. The witness said no, she's best friends with Julie's sister Jillian. Jillian is married to Chris Albert, and Chris is the little brother of Brian. The defense points out for the Canton PD, their main connection is Kevin, who is Brian's brother and is in the department. You were contacted by another law enforcement agency that's not Massachusetts State Police or Canton in April of 2023 at your residence. Later that day, you sat down for a formal interview. In that interview, they informed you specifically it's a crime to lie to them even during an interview. And they informed you they were investigating certain circumstances surrounding your involvement at Fairview. They were interviewing about what you're testifying to here. Jen says it's pretty vague, but it was mainly about John's death. She said her first introduction to them was they walked up to her car and didn't identify themselves, and they asked if she was Jen McCabe. She said she was not because initially she thought they were selling something. They were still outside her house and they called. They identified themselves as law enforcement agents who were not with Canton or the Massachusetts State Police. They wanted an interview, and so Jen told them she would, but needed about 10 minutes to get ready. She allowed them inside and did a brief formal interview, and they explained it would be a crime if she lied to them. During the interview, her husband, Matt, came home. The defense. At some point, you suspended the interview saying you weren't comfortable continuing? Yes. Defense. Before leaving, did they ask if you contacted anyone in the 10 minutes you said you needed to get ready and you told them you contacted your husband, Matt, which is why he came home, and you called Carrie Roberts? He brings in the report. It says one of the first 2 calls you made after being contacted was to Carrie. Jen said, yes, I was curious if they had already reached out to her. Defense, you wanted to know what she told them, and Jen says no. You wanted to be sure your stories lined up? No. She said, we both know what happened. Defense, if that's true, there's no reason to call her and ask if she's been contacted. Jen said, we call each other about everything, and there's nothing more than that. We did that with the media. We did that when Miss Reed's investigator showed up, and we're just not used to this. The defense is just hammering on this to see if they talk to make sure stories lined up, and every time she denies it. Defense, if you're telling the truth, there'd be no reason to contact her. Jen said it's really simple, just to see if they had reached out to her. The defense talks about the timeline they put together and says it's another example of you two comparing stories, and she says no. After you gave answers to the separate law enforcement agency, they asked if there was anyone else you contacted in that 10-minute period before they talked to you, and your answer was no, and that is a lie. The witness said it wasn't a lie. Defense says wasn't the truth. You said you contacted Matt and Carrie. You talked to them and others in addition to Matt and Carrie. When you said no, that would by definition be a lie. And she says no. It's the way you're asking the question. If I could explain, it would make more sense to you. The defense says the agents asked, did you contact anyone from the time they called? And in the 10 minutes they walked in the door, you told them Matt and Carrie. They asked if you contacted anyone else other than them, and you said no. The witness said, at that moment, I said no. Two officers from a different agency came in. I just dropped off my kids at school, and she kind of starts laughing here and says, going to be completely honest, I hadn't brushed my teeth. The defense objects for non-responsive. That's sustained. The defense said, when you said you had not contacted anyone else, they told you it was a crime to lie, and they left you their card. And did you call them back and say, my husband told me I lied and needed to clear that up? There is a sidebar. And when they come back, you explain you had been untruthful. Jen said, I forgot to mention a couple of people I reached out to. The defense says you forgot who you contacted 30 minutes before. There were 5 people: Matt, Carrie, Peggy O'Keefe, the DA's office. Jen interrupts and said it was the witness advocate who works for the DA. And the defense says you also left out you contacted Brian Albert himself. Jen says, yes, he's my brother-in-law. The defense says the 30 years Boston police detective and on whose lawn John was found dead or dying, and you did not want them to know you communicated with Brian just before you talked to them. There's a reason you didn't want to tell them. Jen said she forgot who she called. The defense said, and you had an epiphany when they walked out the door. Moving back to the waterfall, she said there was no tension between Karen and John and nobody seemed drunk. Defense, you saw Brian Higgins and Brian Albert at a high-top table together through the course of that evening. She says they were all around that high-top table at some point or the other. Defense says John and Karen were further off near the bar as opposed to the table. She said everybody moved around, and she personally spent the majority of the time there talking to Karen. Defense, did you ever see Brian Higgins and Brian Albert get physical that night? No. Defense, you've seen when they get up and get physical? The witness said it was more playful. Defense says it's almost like sparring. The witness said she saw it on the video and it's blurry, so I don't know what they were doing. They were being playful. Defense, they took a fighting stance and came at each other. The witness saw them grabbing at each other on the video, but didn't pay much attention to it. The defense says later, everybody goes to 34 Fairview. When you left Waterfall, the people still there were your husband and John. You walked out with Karen and another woman, and you asked Karen why not ride with you, not knowing how long your husband and John were going to be. And there is a video of you in the cold waiting. The witness said she was also talking to somebody else who was out there. The defense says Karen declined your invite and went with John. You walked away with your husband and went to 34 Fairview. He asked who was there when she arrived. When she walked in, there was Brian, Albert Jr., Julie, Sarah, Caitlin, and Albert. They were sitting at the kitchen table. She said Brian Albert and Brian Higgins were in a TV room connected to the kitchen, and she thinks maybe they were looking at a photo. They bring in a photo of the house. There is the front door. To the right of the front door, there is a second door that leads into the front of the house, and then a third door you can see from the front that is attached to the side of the garage to get into there. When she pulled in the driveway, there was a Jeep in front of the house, and the defense asks if there was a snowplow on the front of that Jeep, and was that Brian Higgins' Jeep. It was parked in front of the mailbox, which is next to the driveway. The back edge of the Jeep was at the side of the driveway. That means he's in the house and it's not moving, and the witness agrees. Did you see Karen's car pull up? Jen said she was told a car was outside, so she went and looked and saw it straight ahead. The defense says in line with the Jeep. She says yes, in front of the Jeep, but she wasn't sure of the distance between the two cars. Defense, in January 2022, you interviewed in your home with Trooper Proctor. You said you first saw Karen's car parked by the driveway. She said she didn't say that. I said straight out the front door. Trooper Proctor wrote in a report about the January 29th interview, and you've seen it. What time was the interview? Jen said it was in the afternoon. She said she had been contacted by Proctor while at 34 Fairview, and they decided to meet at her house to do the interview. The defense says, in addition, you and your husband asked your brother in law, Brian Albert, to come. And the witness says, yes, he was in the house during that interview, and she had talked to Brian before the interview. The defense asks if she remembers what she said to Proctor about the SUV in front of the house. The witness said it was straight ahead when I looked out the front door. The defense says you first said it was parked on the street by the driveway facing Chapman. Jen said those were not her words. Defense, you've indicated after the events you've spoken extensively to family and friends about what happened, including Brian Albert, Chris and Julie Albert, and Brian Higgins. The witness says she has not spoken to Brian Higgins since John's wake. The defense says Higgins suggested you call Officer Lank to come back for the additional statement, and the witness said he may have suggested that. The defense, in those discussions with all these people, you talked about that night in detail, like who was at Waterfall, who arrived when, and the witness said not really everyone knows when people came and went. They've talked about how to deal with what they've been through. The defense goes back to that morning at Fairview, and she said she was just trying to piece together what happened. They were sitting there in shock, just waiting to hear about John. The defense says, so everyone coordinated their statements without law enforcement oversight. The witness said it was my family and friends. I was in shock. They were asking me what happened, and I told them, but it was no story. That's my family. They were there with me. The defense asked if they were separated by law enforcement, and she said there was no reason to separate us. Defense, I'm not asking if there was a reason. Was everyone talking amongst themselves? Again, she said there was no need for them to separate. They go back and forth about this for a hot minute. The witness said at one point when Lank was in the house, he talked to everyone separately, but nobody was taken to the station. The defense says Proctor didn't come to the scene of the incident. He went to your house. She said the reason is she had to go get her kids. Defense, Brian came before Trooper Proctor and he was in the house for the interview? Yes. Just before Carrie testified at the grand jury, were you with her? The witness says she doesn't recall what he's talking about. The defense asks about her testifying at the grand jury and if she and Carrie were in a waiting room together before testifying, and she says yes. Defense, when she testified, was it before or after you got together and created the timeline? The witness said that was done right after John passed. Moving on to the Albert family dog, Chloe. The defense mentions it's a German Shepherd, a big dog. When you went inside January 29th at 6:40 a.m., you said you burst into the bedroom to wake your sister and Brian. It's dark out. There's chaos on the lawn. The witness said it was more down the side lawn, down the street. The defense says there's screaming between Carrie and Karen. And at 6:40 in the morning, in the dark, you walk in the unlocked front door of their house, climb the stairs to the bedroom. You walk into the bedroom door, and when you went through, you busted in. It was chaotic, and you were amped up. The witness said she didn't think she used those words. Defense asked, did you gently nudge them? She said, no. I said, Brian, Nicole, wake up. The defense yells, Brian and Nicole, and she says, I don't know if it was that loud. But the defense asked, what was the dog's reaction? She doesn't recall seeing the dog. Defense, you know that dog sleeps in their room. The witness said it may, but I don't know for sure. Defense, the dog wasn't there, was it? She says she doesn't remember the dog, but it doesn't mean it wasn't there. Did you ever hear from Brian the dog wasn't good with strangers? The witness doesn't know. She knew she could not bring her own dog over, and the defense says because of aggression with other dogs, and she says possibly. Who was the last person to leave 34 Fairview? And she said Caitlin, her niece. Defense, at some point you looked out the storm door, which is all glass. He puts the photo of the house back up again and has her point out where their bedroom is. It is the upper left window on the second floor. So you looked out and saw the SUV directly in front of you, not by the mailbox, but did you see the Jeep? She said she wasn't really paying attention and she does not know what time this was. The defense asked if 1223 sounds familiar, and she isn't sure. Defense, when you looked out the door, did you see other cars at that time other than the Jeep and Karen's SUV? She said she thinks she saw lights in her peripheral vision to the left, and that would have been Ryan's truck. Defense, months after the fact, you became interested to find out what time you saw his truck. So you asked Ryan's sister to send you something. Yes, I asked her to send me a screenshot of a text message between Julie and Ryan. Defense, you knew Julie was a witness in this case, and she believes so. Defense, she was in the house when Karen's car appeared? Yes. Defense, you knew she was a witness in the case as well as everyone in the house when you asked for that screenshot. Another example of you coordinating information with other witnesses. Did Proctor ask you not to do that? And she doesn't recall. Defense, this would be a breach of that agreement. Objection sustained. Defense, when you got the screenshot, did you share it with law enforcement? And she doesn't know. Defense, you never provided it to Proctor or anyone, and the only reason we know about this screenshot is from the download of your phone. She doesn't know. Defense, you asked for that for your own personal use? She says yes. The defense says, and indeed, you do know when you looked out and saw Ryan's truck because the screenshot told you that. The witness said it told when he pulled up, not what I saw. The defense says 1223 sound about right? Yes. They have Jen look at the screenshot to see if it refreshes her memory of the time, and it doesn't. He hands her more documents to look at, doesn't refresh her memory. The screenshot said something about outside. The witness said that the text message said here or something like that. It was a screenshot of a text from Ryan to Julie indicating he had arrived at 34 Fairview. Defense, you saw Julie go outside? Yes. She came back in alone soon after. She talked to her brother and then came back in. Defense, you saw Ryan's truck and Karen's SUV? She said she saw lights in her peripheral vision to the left. The defense asks, from right to left, was it Karen's SUV, Higgins' Jeep, a space, and then his truck, or was the truck behind the Jeep? She doesn't know. The defense says at a prior hearing, you said Karen's SUV, the Jeep, a space, and then Ryan's truck. Was Brian's Jeep between Ryan's truck and Karen's SUV? The witness said, I know her car was here, and she's kind of pointing, and there were lights in my peripheral vision. So I assumed the Jeep was still parked at the mailbox. I wasn't studying outside. I glanced out and went back to the table. The defense, where was the Jeep? In front of the SUV or in front of the truck? The witness said, I'm telling you what I saw. Karen's car was there, and there were lights in my peripheral. The defense says, when you saw Karen's SUV pull up, you quickly sent a text to John. Jen said when she walked to the door and saw the car, that's when she sent the text that said here with a question mark. You saw the SUV move up? She said the next time she looked out, it was in a different location. And then she's asked if she saw the white Jeep move, and she said she never really looked at the Jeep, but didn't see it move, and it was in the same spot until Higgins left. Defense, in the course of 19 minutes, you went to the door 5 times, and she doesn't know. The defense says for every time you looked out and saw the SUV, you texted something. Jen says, I did text 5 times. That's correct. The second time she looked out, the SUV was near the flagpole, and that's when she texted, pull behind me, because she didn't know if they were confused whether or not they were at the right house. 1240, you saw the SUV had moved again and you texted hello with a question mark. Where was the SUV? She said the first time it was straight ahead when she looked out the door. The second time it was down at the flagpole, and then the third time further up. The defense, at 1242, you texted, where are you? And she's asked, where was the car? She doesn't know. 1245, you texted hello, question mark. And that's the last time you saw the vehicle? She said, I'm not saying that today. But the defense says, did you say it previously? Jen asked to see a transcript, and the defense says, you just read it. You testified you went a final time to the door and saw the SUV was gone. And she says, correct. The defense says at bare minimum, you were looking outside 4 times. Jen said that's last year's testimony, but for this year, for certain, she looked out twice. He goes through the text messages and says it's 4. And now you're saying you went to the door a minimum of 4 times. Your view of the SUV, you had a clear view? She said, yes, I could see it. Defense, at no time going back and forth, texting, seeing the SUV in different positions. You didn't hear any unusual noises, screaming, loud voices, cussing, doors slamming, arguments, or revving engine, the squealing of tires, a crash, screams for help, moaning or groaning. No. You saw tire tracks in the road from the snow. She said, yes, the street light illuminated those tire tracks. Defense, you detailed not only the shape of the tracks looking like a wave, but also where they were. She said she saw them over to the left if she's looking outside the door. Defense, the only thing between you and the SUV was the lawn? Yes. He asked if it's a straight shot, meaning no ditches, no berms, and she says no. He shows another photo of the house. Clearly, this is in spring. The grass looked green. There's no snow. And you do see that second door to the right of the main door. It's kind of in a recess. And at no time when you looked outside, did you see John standing, sitting, or a body in the snow? No. Defense, John's a big boy. You didn't see him in the snow the way you found him? No. They left around 1:30 to 1:45 that morning in their Yukon. Her husband was driving, Jen was in the front seat, and Sarah and Julie were in the back seat, and they went towards Chapman, towards the flagpole side. They drove adjacent to where John's body was ultimately found. And he asked if anybody saw anything in the snow. Jen said she wasn't looking. She was turned around talking to Sarah and Julie about the bread and peanut butter in the car. Defense, when you went to Fairview after 6, you said visibility was poor and you couldn't see John. It was Karen who saw him and jumped out to attend to him immediately. Then Carrie, and then you. The witness said she got out of the car and walked over. Defense, yesterday you testified you couldn't see anything close to the flagpole. You said it was whiteout conditions. You could see shadowy figures of Karen and Carrie. And it wasn't until you got very close that you were able to see John? And she says yes. Defense, last year you testified to something different. You said you got out on the passenger side, furthest from the lawn. And as you got out of the car, you noted Karen was already at John. Jen says, as I got out and walked around the car, the shadowy figure of Karen had already gotten onto something. Defense, you said as you got out, you noted she was straddling John, lifted her shirt, lifted his shirt, and then laid on top of him. Carrie was getting snow off of his face. Is this what you testified to last year? She doesn't know. I'm going to tell you, the defense attorney got his steps in today because he was back and forth to that witness stand with transcripts for the rest of the day, pretty much. And he offers to show her a transcript. Jen said, I may have used different words, but what I saw was the same. He goes to give her the transcript and she says, I don't need it. We're fighting over silly words. And the defense says words matter a lot. The judge at this point jumps in, essentially telling both of them to simmer down. She says she doesn't remember what she testified to last year, so he hands her a transcript and says, see what it says. She said, I see what I said, but it's a little different than what you said. Defense, when you got out of the vehicle, you could see her pull up her shirt to give him skin to skin. She said, I was on the passenger side, so as I got out, she was already at John. Defense, by the time you come around the car, she's already there. And when she gets over there, what could you see at that point? You said straddling John, lifts his shirt and her shirt and lays on him. And Miss Roberts was removing the snow from his face. Defense, clearly you didn't indicate last year it was a whiteout condition and you had to get close to them before you could see anything. Yesterday, you said you had to get very close before you could recognize it was a body. And last year, you were still at the car when you saw Karen giving aid to John. There's an objection, and the judge asks, "Is that what you said?" And Jen says no. Defense, is there a reason you might wish to improve your testimony this year regarding the distance you could see? She says no. You claimed on direct today Karen looked at you at the scene and said, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." And she says yes. Defense, that was so impactful that it had the effect of putting you in shock and horror. The witness said, "I was shocked that whole morning, and that statement was a lot." The defense, at the grand jury in April of 2022, you testified and took an oath, and that included telling the truth and the whole truth. She says yes. The defense says this was only weeks after the incident. Events are much fresher. She says, "I wouldn't say that." The defense, especially something huge from my client saying she hit him. Would you overlook that? No. Defense, the reason you wouldn't is because it was so impactful hearing that 3 times. Yes. He walks up and hands her a transcript from her grand jury testimony. And he asks, "Was it important to you to tell these jurors she said 3 times she hit him?" Jen says, "I'm answering your questions, and your client said she hit him." Defense, in your entire grand jury testimony, you never said my client said she hit him. She's got the transcript there, by the way, and she says this is 220 pages. He asked her the question again, and she said she testified a number of times, but I was there when she said it. I'm not sure if I told that to the grand jury. Defense, you were asked 12 times in your grand jury testimony to repeat things Karen said from that morning. You recounted those words because you were under oath, the same oath you are here today, and things were much fresher then. Jen says, Karen said I hit him as fresh today as it was then in her mind. Defense, you recounted what she said over the phone, and what she said at 4:53 was, "Did I hit him? Could I have hit him?" The witness said Karen did not say that at 4:53. Defense, did you testify what Karen said was, "Could I hit him? Did I hit him?" Yes. Did you answer questions concerning my client's statement? Yes. And the answer was, she said, "Could I have hit him, correct?" Jen says, "Yes, that is part of the answer I gave." He tells her to turn to another page in this transcript, and the judge pipes in and says she needs context. So there is a sidebar. The defense, were you talking about a statement made in Karen's car before you got to the scene? She looks over the transcript and says yes. She said, "Could I have hit him?" Has her turn to another page, another conversation in Karen's car. The phrase you attributed to my client is, "Could I have hit him?" She says yes. He has her turn to another page. The context of this is in John's driveway, and she's asking if she could have hit him. The witness says yes. She said that when she showed me her tail light. He has her flip to another page, and this is regarding driving over to Fairview. She testified, Karen said, "What if I hit him? Could I have hit him?" Flipping to another page, Karen again asks, "Could I have hit him? Correct?" The witness says, "Yes, I see that here as part of my answer." Another page. This is at the scene at Fairview. You told the grand jury under oath, "Did I hit him? Could I have hit him?" Flipping to another page. You recounted to the grand jury a conversation you said my client had with a female EMT standing there as you testified today. What did you say my client said to the EMT? Did I hit him? Could I have hit him? Is he dead? Jen said there were just different times they were talking to lots of people who were on scene. The defense approaches again, just rinse and repeat. She was saying, "Could I have hit him? Did I?" over and over. But not one time did you utter the phrase, "I hit him," as it relates to my client in front of the grand jury. Not once. Jen says she would have had to read through all 200 plus pages of the transcript. So he asks again. Jen pretty much concedes that she said, "Could I have hit him? Did I hit him?" But she said, your client said, "I hit him 3 times with a female EMT standing there." Defense, you spoke with Trooper Proctor the same day. He was taking notes. You never told him my client said that, did you? She said, "Oh, I told him." The defense, did he leave that out of his report? She doesn't know. So he hands her Trooper Proctor's report and asks, "Do you see I hit him as it refers to my client in that report?" There is an objection that's sustained. Do you recall telling Trooper Proctor? She said, yes, I told him. Defense, he was taking notes. She says, yes. The defense, later in the morning, after you're back at 34 Fairview, the witnesses weren't sequestered. She said, we were friends and family sitting together. Defense, at some point, you said you did reach back out to Mike Lank. Who is he in your world? She said he was a local guy she knew and was friendly with, and she knew him from around town. Defense, so you decide to call Sergeant Lank back to the scene because you wanted to provide additional information. How did you get his phone number? She said Julie Albert had his cell phone, and she was there at 34 Fairview. The defense asks if Chris and Brian Higgins were there as well. Yes. Higgins suggested you reach out to the officer. She said she's not sure it was him, but as she was remembering things, she can't say who did or didn't tell her to call. Defense, you were remembering things and telling others, and they were absorbing that. The witness says I was recounting what transpired since that first phone call. The defense, you wanted to tell Sergeant Lank, and whatever he was doing, he stopped and came back to 34 Fairview, and she said it was fairly quickly. Defense, you said you had information that was important enough. She said that she told him she was remembering things. The defense says, so he drove in a blizzard to come back. Whatever it was you told him, it was important enough to have an immediate meeting, nothing you want to sit on. Jen said he told me if I remembered anything to call. Defense, you testified this morning. She said, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. The report says, I hope I didn't hit him. So he hands her the report and says, what you told Officer Lank was, I hope I didn't hit him, correct? The witness said that is incorrect. I told him, she said I hit him. The defense, is this another example of an officer getting the report wrong? There's an objection that's sustained and the judge says to move on. You testified yesterday during that first call at 4:53. Karen told you she had gotten into a fight with John. Her taillight was cracked and she asked, could I have hit him? Jen said that's incorrect. On the first call, she said they had gotten into a fight and Karen said she had left him at the waterfall. In the second call, once I told her I saw her outside my sister's house, she said she could have hit him and also talked about her broken taillight. Defense. About 2 hours after Karen found John and began giving him CPR, you were interviewed by Sean Good. There's a sidebar. He comes back and rephrases and has to a few times. The witness said she does not remember a formal interview with Sean Good, but they did talk at the scene. Defense, you told him about the 4:53 call and she doesn't remember. Did you know him? She said she knew of him because his sister is a year or two younger than her and she knew that her brother was a cop. Defense, you told Sergeant Good at the time when he asked about the first call, she was inquiring about John's whereabouts. Jen says she just doesn't remember her talk with him. Defense, you have no memory of what you talked to Sergeant Good about. She said she doesn't remember the specifics during the chaotic scene. Defense, did you tell any officer while at the scene during those couple of calls with Karen that there was screaming and hysteria? She said pretty much everybody was asking about John, like does he have medical conditions and things like that. Did you tell one officer about the initial call that John may be missing? Jen said possibly. I may have said I got a phone call and we're here looking. Did you say anything about a fight between Karen and John? She said there were many different conversations and she doesn't know. Do you remember telling any officer about a cracked taillight at the scene? She said the conversations were about what was happening at the scene and Karen was running around screaming. Defense asks if Officer Mullaney interviewed her. She said again, could have, but I'm not sure. I don't remember every officer. I just found my friend on the ground. I don't remember. You told Sergeant Lank you got a call from Kaylee's phone and Karen was distraught because John never came home. And you don't mention to Sergeant Lank anything about a fight? She doesn't remember. The defense, you remember in detail in testimony that my client woke you up from your sleep. With Sergeant Lank, you didn't say a thing about a fight? The witness says she doesn't remember. She said, I was woken up. Karen showed up to my house and we found one of my closest friends on the front lawn. She's talking over the defense attorney and the judge allows her to finish. She said, it took me days to remember everything. I was in a state of shock. And when I remembered her saying I hit him, I called Officer Lank. Defense, but you never said it to a grand jury? The witness says, Karen said, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. I can tell you she screamed it. Defense, but you never said it to the grand jury. She says she doesn't recall. Defense, you were asked that specifically. What did she say in front of the female EMT? And you just read what you said. The witness says, I don't know if I was asked what Karen specifically said to a female EMT. But the defense keeps talking, and the judge tells the jurors to ignore the comments of counsel. Defense, you testified under oath at the grand jury. She said, could I have hit him? Did I hit him in the presence of the female EMT? The witness says yes, because she also said that. The judge is like, folks, we're done for the day. By the way, court is dark tomorrow. No live stream. I'm going to catch up on Donna Adelson's hearing from today, as well as Lori Daybell. There's some action in both those cases, so look for that tomorrow. That is it for this episode. Hope you guys have a good rest of your evening, and we will see you soon.